She was probably 16, maybe 17, standing in a courtyard smaller than a modern parking space, flour on her hands, a toddler pulling at her tunic, another child crying somewhere behind the stone wall. No books, no school, no one to call, no elder woman handing her a guide to raising children, and the child at her feet was the Son of God. The Gospels give us 12 verses for 30 years of his life. 12. That is all the text offers for 3 full decades, from the birth in Bethlehem to the baptism in the Jordan. Everything between those 2 moments is silence. But archaeology, Jewish tradition, and the scriptures themselves fill that silence with a picture so vivid, so physically real, so far from the golden haloed paintings in museum galleries, that it changes the way you understand everything Jesus ever said and did. Close your eyes. We are stepping into her courtyard, and what you are about to see looks nothing like the paintings. Forget the quiet boy kneeling in a sunlit room with a beam of light across his face. Mary raised Jesus in a 2-room house carved into limestone bedrock on the southern slope of a hill in Lower Galilee. Archaeologist Ken Dark, working beneath the Sisters of Nazareth convent, excavated the remains of a 1st-century dwelling cut directly into the rock. Walls of rough fieldstone, a low doorway, a cramped interior that would have been dark even at midday. Yardina Alexandra found another 1st-century house in 2006 beneath the International Marian Center, just a few hundred meters away. Same period, same village, same construction. The houses of Nazareth were not freestanding structures. They were carved into the hillside, with 1 or 2 rooms built forward from the rock face, roofed with wooden beams, branches, and packed mud. The floor was beaten earth, not tiles, not flagstone. The ceiling was low enough that a tall man would duck, and the lower room, slightly below grade, was where the family's animals spent the night. A donkey, a few goats, perhaps chickens. Body heat from the animals rose and warmed the sleeping area above. There was no glass in the windows, no doors that locked, no separation between the noise of the animals below and the family above. Privacy did not exist. The courtyard, shared with extended family, aunts, cousins, grandparents, was where most of the day's work happened. Cooking, grinding, weaving, mending tools, washing clothes, nursing babies, arguing, praying, and teaching children all took place within a few square meters of packed dirt and limestone, in full view and earshot of everyone. This is where she taught him to walk. This is where she whispered the Shema over his sleeping body. This is where every prayer, every skill, every word he would ever speak was first poured into him by a teenage girl who almost certainly could not read. She swaddled him in linen strips roughly 4 fingers wide, arms pressed to his sides, legs held straight. The method Ezekiel 16:4 describes, the method Jewish mothers had practiced for centuries. Swaddling was not tenderness alone. In a house with animals and a dirt floor, it protected a newborn from cold, from insects, from the rough edges of daily life. She would have changed and rewrapped the cloths several times a day, washing them by hand in water carried from the village spring. She nursed him for approximately 3 years. This was standard practice. The Talmud records it. 2 Maccabees 7:27 references it. In a world without infant formula, without pasteurized milk, without refrigeration, a mother's body was the only reliable food source for a young child. Cow's milk was dangerous. Contamination, bacteria, parasitic illness. Goat's milk was safer but still unreliable. Breast milk was survival. And infant mortality in 1st century Galilee ran close to 30%. Nearly 1 in 3 children did not survive to age 5. A cough that lingered could turn fatal. A fever that spiked in the night could end a life before sunrise. Dysentery from contaminated water killed more children than any war. Mary watched him constantly. She slept with him pressed against her body on a reed mat laid over the packed earth floor, covered by a woolen cloak that served as both garment and blanket. Every night, as darkness filled the house and the oil lamp flickered low, she spoke the same words Jewish mothers had whispered for generations. Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Deuteronomy 6:4. The words Jesus would later call the greatest commandment when a scribe asked him which law mattered most. He did not discover those words as a traveling rabbi debating in the synagogue. He learned them from her, in the dark, before he could speak, pressed against her body on a dirt floor in a village of 400 people that no prophet had ever mentioned, and no army had ever bothered to conquer. At age 3, the formal teaching began. The Mishnah is specific. A Jewish boy begins Torah at 5, Mishnah at 10, but informal instruction from the mother started as early as the child could repeat words, typically around 3. The first teacher was always the mother. The father's role in formal education came later. In the earliest years, the mother shaped the child's tongue, his memory, his moral vocabulary. Picture it. Mary sits on a mat in the courtyard, her back against the warm limestone wall. A barefoot boy in a rough linen tunic sits facing her. She holds his hands. She speaks a line of Torah. He repeats it. She corrects the pronunciation. He tries again. She nods. They move to the next line. This was not a lesson in the modern sense, a scheduled event with a beginning and end. This was air. Deuteronomy 6:7 commands it. Teach them to your children, speaking of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. 4 moments, every day. Grinding grain at the stone quern, she taught him. Carrying water from the spring, she taught him. Lying on the sleeping mat before the lamp went out, she taught him. Rising before dawn to start the fire, she taught him. The Torah was not a subject. It was the texture of daily life, woven into every action the way breath is woven into the body. By age 5, he likely knew entire passages of the Torah by heart. By 10, he would have been studying Mishnah, the oral interpretations and applications of the law. By 13, he was bar mitzvah, a son of the commandment, personally responsible before God for his own observance. The Son of God learned Scripture the way every Jewish boy in Galilee learned it, from his mother's mouth, repeated back to her in a stone courtyard, pressed into his memory by the rhythm of her daily work. And he was not sitting in a corner being holy. By 4, he was carrying things, small bundles of kindling, clay water jars sized for a child's hands. By 5, he was helping at the grinding stone, the rotary quern that every household used to turn grain into flour each morning before dawn. The work was monotonous and physically demanding even for an adult. For a child, it was training. By 7, he was running errands across the village, delivering bread to a neighbor, fetching a tool from a relative's workshop, carrying messages. He carried water from the spring, the one still called Mary's Well today, the only water source for all of Nazareth. Archaeological surveys confirm there was a single spring feeding the village. Every family sent someone, usually a woman or a child, to fill heavy clay jars and carry them back uphill. A full water jar weighed roughly 15 kilograms. A child carried a smaller jar but made more trips. He gathered fuel, olive wood, dried thorn branches, twigs, and animal dung, pressed into flat cakes and dried in the sun. Every Galilean child collected fuel. Cooking required a fire that burned for hours, and wood was scarce in the rocky terrain around Nazareth. The tabun oven, a dome-shaped clay oven built into the courtyard floor, consumed fuel constantly. Without it, there was no bread. Without bread, there was no meal. Fuel collection was not a chore that could be skipped. It was a daily obligation that fell to the youngest members of the household. And he watched his siblings. Mark 6:3 names 4 brothers, James, Joseph, Judas, Simon, and mentions sisters, plural, without naming them. In a 2-room house with a shared courtyard, the oldest child is never off duty. He held babies while Mary's hands were full of dough or wet laundry. He kept toddlers away from the tabun oven, whose exterior surface was hot enough to cause serious burns. He carried younger siblings on his hip, the universal posture of older children across the ancient world, visible in Egyptian paintings, Mesopotamian reliefs, and Greek pottery. The hands that would one day break bread for 5,000 were first calloused by chisel and stone and roughened by carrying a younger brother across a rocky courtyard. Joseph was a tekton, a word usually translated as carpenter, but which more accurately means a craftsman who worked with both wood and stone. In Galilee, where timber was limited but limestone was everywhere, a tekton spent more time cutting and shaping stone than wood. He made door lintels, olive presses, millstones, stone storage vessels, and the rough building blocks used for house construction. His workshop was probably not a separate building, more likely a section of the courtyard or a lean-to built against the house wall. Jesus would have entered this workspace by age 8 or 9, watching, handing tools, learning to use a plumb line and a chisel. By 12, he was carrying Joseph's tools to job sites. Archaeological evidence suggests that the nearby city of Sepphoris, the administrative capital of Galilee, only 6 kilometers from Nazareth, was undergoing major construction during Jesus' youth. Herod Antipas was rebuilding it as his capital after inheriting the territory from his father, and the demand for skilled labor, stonemasons, plasterers, carpenters, mosaic layers, was enormous. It is historically plausible that Joseph and the teenage Jesus walked the hour-long road to Sepphoris to work on construction projects, earning daily wages that supplemented the family's subsistence farming. If so, Jesus would have been exposed to a world vastly different from Nazareth: Greek-speaking populations, Roman architectural styles, a theater seating 4,000, colonnaded streets, a marketplace selling goods imported from across the Mediterranean. The contrast between the cosmopolitan city and the conservative Jewish village 6 kilometers away would have been stark. A boy who prayed the Shema with his mother at dawn walked to a city where Greek actors performed in a Roman-style theater by afternoon. Some scholars believe this exposure influenced Jesus' later teaching vocabulary. The Greek word Hippocrates, which he used to describe the Pharisees, literally means stage actor, a word most naturally learned by someone who had seen a theater. The family's diet was simple and remarkably consistent. Bread was the foundation, eaten at every meal, dipped in olive oil or used to scoop lentil stew from a shared clay bowl. Olives, both fresh and pressed into oil, were a daily staple. Figs, dates, and pomegranates provided sweetness and energy. Onions, garlic, leeks, and cucumbers grew in small garden plots tended in the courtyard or on nearby terraces. Lentils and chickpeas were the primary source of protein for families who could not afford meat regularly. Fish, dried, salted, or occasionally fresh if someone traveled to the Sea of Galilee, roughly 30 kilometers east, appeared when trade or travel made it available. Meat was rare, A goat or a lamb might be slaughtered for a wedding, a festival, or when guests of honor arrived, but daily meals were vegetarian by economic necessity, not by choice. Wine, diluted with water at a ratio of roughly 2 or 3 parts water to 1 part wine, was the universal drink for adults and older children. Clean water was scarce and often contaminated. Wine's mild acidity made it safer than untreated spring water, especially during summer months. The rhythm of meals was fixed. A light morning meal after the dawn work, bread, oil, olives. The main meal came in the late afternoon or evening when the day's labor was finished. The family gathered on the floor around a single dish. Everyone ate with their hands, tearing bread and using it as a utensil. There were no individual plates. The shared bowl was the center of the meal, and the act of eating together, dipping bread into the same dish, was an act of intimacy and trust. When Jesus later said at the Last Supper, "The one who dips his hand into the bowl with me will betray me," the image carried the weight of a lifetime of shared meals. To betray someone who had eaten from the same dish was, in the culture Jesus grew up in, the deepest possible violation of trust. Mary's daily routine was relentless. She rose before dawn, probably around 4 in the morning during the summer months, to grind grain. The rotary quern required roughly an hour of continuous grinding to produce enough flour for a day's bread. She mixed the flour with water, salt, and a piece of fermented dough saved from the previous day's batch as leavening. She shaped the loaves flat, round discs roughly the size of a dinner plate, and baked them against the inner wall of the taban oven or on heated stones. Breakfast, such as it was, consisted of bread dipped in olive oil or eaten with a handful of olives, dried figs, or occasionally a piece of cheese made from goat's milk. Water had to be fetched, probably twice a day, once in the early morning and once in the late afternoon. Laundry was done by hand, beaten on rocks and rinsed at the spring or in basins. Clothing was made at home. Mary would have spun thread from raw wool or flax using a hand spindle, a wooden stick with a clay or stone whorl. The thread was then woven into fabric on a simple loom. A single garment could take weeks to produce. When Jesus later told a parable about a woman searching for a lost coin and sweeping her entire house, he was describing his mother's world, a house so small that a single coin could disappear into the packed earth floor, and so dark that finding it required a lamp even during the day. Friday evening. The sun touches the western hills above the Jezreel Valley. Mary has been working since before dawn. The bread is pulled from the tabun, still warm. Lentil stew simmers in a clay pot. The courtyard is swept. The children are called inside. She kindles the Sabbath lamps, small clay oil lamps, single wicks, filled with olive oil. On Sabbath Eve, more than one. The warm light fills the small room. The work stops. The world goes quiet. She speaks the blessing. "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments." Jesus watches her. Every Friday, for 30 years. The same motion, the same words, the same pause as the village falls silent and the day of rest descends. The family gathers on the mat. No table, no chairs. Families in 1st century Galilee ate seated on the floor or on low cushions around a shared dish. Mary serves the bread. Jesus, as the eldest son, breaks pieces and passes them to his brothers and sisters. The wine, diluted with water as was universal practice, is blessed. This was not a grand meal. It was bread, stew, oil, wine, and the presence of family. But the ritual structure, blessing, breaking, passing, was the same every week year after year, for 3 decades. And decades later, in an upper room in Jerusalem, on the night before his death, Jesus would take bread, break it, and hand it to his disciples with the words, "This is my body, given for you." He had been doing that motion since he was a child. He learned it from his mother. On Sabbath morning, the family walked to the synagogue. Nazareth's synagogue was probably not the grand stone structure later tradition imagined. Archaeological evidence from comparable Galilean villages suggests it was a modest public room, possibly adapted from an existing building, a large house or a communal hall with stone benches along the walls. The community gathered. The Torah scroll, handwritten on parchment, stored in a wooden or stone container, was brought out with reverence. Portions were read aloud in Hebrew and then translated into Aramaic, the everyday language of Galilean Jews, by a meturgeman, a translator who stood beside the reader. Men were called to read in rotation. Boys listened, absorbing the sounds and rhythms of sacred Hebrew long before they fully understood every word. Sometime around age 6 or 7, Jesus would have begun attending Beth Sefer, the village school attached to the synagogue, where boys learned to read Torah under the instruction of the Hazan, the synagogue attendant who also served as the local teacher. Students sat on the ground in a semicircle. The teacher read a verse. The boys repeated it in unison. Scrolls were precious and rare. A single Torah scroll represented months of a scribe's labor. So the primary method of instruction was oral repetition, not reading. Memory was the technology. A boy who could recite the entire Torah from memory was called a walking Torah, the highest achievement of Jewish elementary education. And later, in Luke 4, Jesus himself would stand up in this very synagogue, take the scroll of Isaiah, find the exact passage he wanted, and read it aloud, declaring the words fulfilled in their hearing. That moment of confident authority did not come from nowhere. It was built across years of quiet Sabbaths, a boy sitting beside his mother and father, listening to the chanting, absorbing cadences of Hebrew liturgy that would later shape his own teaching voice. He was 12 when she lost him. Luke 2:41-52, Passover in Jerusalem. 80 miles on foot, a journey of roughly 4 days through the Jordan Valley, or along the ridge route through Samaria. The entire village traveled together in a caravan for safety. Women and younger children walked in one group, men and older boys in another. Extended family members, aunts, uncles, cousins, formed a loose network across the caravan. On the return journey, Mary and Joseph each walked a full day before realizing Jesus was not with either group. For a modern reader, this sounds like negligence. It was not. In a caravan of dozens of relatives, children moved freely between groups. A 12-year-old boy might walk with his cousins, with his uncles, with older friends. Mary assumed he was with Joseph. Joseph assumed he was with Mary. By evening, when the groups converged and camped for the night, neither had seen him. They turned back. 3 days of searching a city swollen with Passover pilgrims, a Jerusalem holding perhaps 300,000 people during the festival. 3 days of asking in the streets, checking with relatives, praying, and imagining every disaster a parent's mind can produce. She found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers of the law, listening to them and asking questions. The scholars were astonished at his understanding. And Mary said the words every mother who has ever lost a child would say, "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been searching for you in great anxiety." His answer, "Why were you searching for me? Did you not know that I must be about my Father's business?" She did not understand. Luke tells us that plainly. But then comes the line that reveals everything about who Mary was. His mother treasured all these things in her heart. She did not understand her own son, but she held every moment, every strange word, every unexplainable event, every silence she could not interpret, and she kept it. Decades later, when Luke was gathering material for his gospel, interviewing witnesses, collecting memories, Mary is almost certainly where the childhood stories came from. No one else knew about the swaddling, the temple at 12, the words spoken between mother and son. She was the first witness, the first keeper of the story. She held it all quietly for 30 years before anyone thought to write it down. The years between 12 and 30 are the deepest silence in the Gospels. We know almost nothing about this period from Scripture. Jewish tradition and historical context allow us to sketch a probable outline, but honesty requires saying that the details are uncertain. Joseph likely died during these years. He is present in the childhood narratives, but absent from every account of Jesus' adult ministry. If Joseph died while Jesus was still young, the eldest son would have become the primary provider for the family. Jesus would have taken over the tekton workshop, supporting his mother and younger siblings through manual labor. The calluses on his hands, the strength in his arms, the endurance that later carried him through 40 days in the wilderness and long journeys on foot through Galilee. All of it was built during these invisible years of work. Mary, meanwhile, continued the life of a Galilean village woman, grinding, baking, spinning, weaving, carrying water, tending animals, raising children. The younger brothers grew. The sisters, unnamed, uncounted, grew alongside them. The house was full, the courtyard was loud, and the son she had been told would sit on the throne of David spent his days cutting stone, and his evenings breaking bread at a shared mat on a dirt floor. Then, one day, he left. He walked to the Jordan River, where a wild prophet named John was baptizing crowds in the muddy water. He did not ask permission. He did not explain. The text does not record what Mary said when he left, or whether she understood why. What followed, the miracles, the crowds, the confrontations, the enemies, happened at a distance she could not close. She appears a few times during his public ministry. At the wedding in Cana, she told the servants, "Do whatever he tells you," words that suggest she understood something about him that even the disciples had not yet grasped. Later, Mark records a moment when Jesus' family came to take him home because they thought he had lost his mind. Whether Mary was among them, or whether she stood at a distance while his brothers acted, the text does not say clearly. But she was there at the end. John places her at the foot of the cross. The woman who had swaddled him in linen watched soldiers strip him. The woman who had whispered the Shema over his cradle heard him cry out to God from a wooden beam. The woman who had searched for him for 3 days in Jerusalem now watched him die in the same city, on a hill visible from the temple where she had found him as a boy. And from the cross, he looked down and entrusted her to the care of the disciple he loved. Because the eldest son's final act, even in death, was to ensure his mother would be provided for. Step back now, the swaddling bands 4 fingers wide, the Shema whispered in the dark, the first Torah verses on his tongue at 3, water carried uphill from the spring, siblings on his hip, the chisel and the stone, bread broken and passed every Friday, the 3 days she searched, the 30 years of silence. This was her life, not for a season, for 3 decades. A teenage girl in a village of 400 people raised the Son of God in a 2-room house with a dirt floor, grinding grain before dawn, teaching scripture with the rhythm of daily work. No books, no school, no formula. Oil lamps, a sleeping mat, the Torah memorized in her own voice. And she did it anyway. The hands that were later nailed to a cross were first held by hers when he learned to walk. The voice that preached the Sermon on the Mount first repeated the Shema back to her in a dark courtyard. The man who fed 5,000 first helped his mother pass bread to his brothers on a Friday evening. When Jesus said, "Blessed are the meek," he was describing her. When he said, "Love your neighbor," she had lived it in a 2-room house with 7 children and no privacy. When he taught the crowds, he was speaking from the rhythm she had built into him before he could read. And here is the quiet truth that no painting has ever captured. If you have ever raised a child with no idea what you were doing, if you have ever spoken the same prayer over a cradle night after night and wondered whether it mattered, if you have ever ground through the repetitive invisible work of feeding and cleaning and teaching and showing up, you are closer to Mary than any cathedral window has ever shown. She did not know who he would become. She showed up every day, ground the grain, lit the lamp, spoke the prayer, and kept going. And the Son of God became who he was because a teenage girl in a village no one remembered did the ordinary, invisible, exhausting work of mothering for 30 years without stopping. What hit you hardest? The Shema whispered over his cradle, the 3 days she searched, or the bread at the Friday table? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one.